Then I guess we're good. Welcome everyone to our discussion on first year evaluation of Biden's foreign policy in Yemen, which is organized by the Washington Center for Yemen Studies. My name is Hadila Muwaffaq, a research fellow with Yemen Policy Center, and I will be moderating the discussion today. Allow me as well to introduce our distinguished speakers for this panel discussion, starting with Mr. Gerald Firestein, who is a senior vice president and a distinguished senior fellow on US diplomacy at the Middle East Institute. He retired from the US Foreign Service in 2016 after a 41-year career with the personal rank of career minister. In 2010, President Obama appointed Ambassador Firestein US ambassador to Yemen, where he served until 2013. Next is Ms. Rasha Jarhoum, a founder and director of the Peace Track Initiative. She is a gender, peace, and security expert with more than 15 years experience working to advocate women's, children's, and refugees' rights with many organizations, including UNICEF and UNDP. In 2016, Jarhoum was invited among 7 women by the UN Special Envoy to Yemen to support the peace talks held in Kuwait. She's also a founding member of the Women's Solidarity Network in Yemen. Finally, we have Dr. Anel Shalain, who's a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute and an expert on religious and political authority in the Middle East and North Africa. Shalain was previously the Swan postdoctoral fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Prior to beginning her PhD, she worked as a journalist in Egypt and Yemen. Welcome again, everyone, and happy to see you here. Just a reminder to our audience, please write in your questions in the chat box or on Facebook. Unfortunately, we will not be allowing audience to unmute themselves and read their questions today. So again, please write in your questions in the chat box, and hopefully our speakers will answer them in the last 20 to 25 minutes of our discussion today. So back to our speakers, I think it would be best to start with an introductory question to all of you that would help you situate yourself within this conversation. You can take 3 to 5 minutes to respond, starting with Ms. Jarhoum, Dr. Shalain, and then Mr. Firestein. So 1 year ago, Joe Biden assumed office as the 46th president of the United States. In his first major foreign policy address, President Biden vowed to end the war in Yemen, and his administration outlined several goals to fulfill this promise, including reversing Trump's designation of the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, ending the US support for the Saudi and UAE offensive operations in Yemen, as well as placing greater emphasis on diplomacy by appointing the career diplomat Tim Linderking as US envoy to Yemen. Yet here we go, today, 1 year later, and the conflict seems to be entering rather a critical phase, with the Houthis not only continuing their attacks on the city of Marib, which holds 3 million people, including 1 million displaced Yemenis, but also Houthis are now moving the war to Saudi Arabia and the UAE with the help of Iran. And then on the other side, we are seeing a sharp escalation from the Saudis and the UAE, which has also, their aerial campaign has targeted civilians and critical civilian infrastructure, especially in the past couple of weeks. So given this situation, how do you assess Biden's administration's first year in office in terms of achieving his foreign policy goals in Yemen? And where do you think the US foreign policy is heading, given the recent developments? You can go ahead, Mr. Jarhoum.
Thank you, Hadil, and thank you for having me to be talking with your esteemed panel. I'm Rasha Jarhoum. I'm a director of Peace Track Initiative, and in the Peace Track Initiative, we work with women groups mainly in Yemen. We focus on feminizing and localizing the peace process, and we focus on 3 components, which is inclusion of women, protecting women human rights defenders and peace builders, and enhancing feminist peace knowledge leadership. We have launched last June the Feminist Peace Roadmap, which is a roadmap that was written jointly with women and public figures in Yemen. That was focusing or was written based on a human rights-based approach. And we are hoping that this Feminist Peace Roadmap is going to be a guiding a framework for mediators and for the negotiators. And in the launch, the US envoy attended. And so addressing your question, Hadil, in terms of the foreign policy, I think the appointment of the US envoy shows a commitment from the US to push diplomatic efforts. And we have felt this and there's the office of his support and his office support of our work, and we continue to collaborate with him and also the UN envoy. Now, I think the diplomatic track has faced a lot of challenges in terms of not being able to convene with the parties, the Houthis being or rejecting to meet with the envoys, whether the US envoy or the UN envoy. So these types of challenges have delayed the, I would say we were aspiring for a political process. It has delayed it now for long than what the Yemeni people can stand. Unfortunately, what we are seeing is an escalation of conflict from all the parties. We're seeing a lot of bombardment now. Human rights violations are increasing, including those that are targeting women. And this is something that we work with. We've seen actually violations against women that has reached a level that we haven't witnessed before in Yemen. And sexual and gender-based violence, unfortunately, is used as a weapon of war to silence women who are perceived to be opposing or having opposing views of armed groups. The majority, unfortunately, is in Houthi-controlled areas who have used this as a weapon against Yemeni women. And this. So in terms of the foreign policy, first, let's talk about when there was designation of the Houthis as terrorist group, and we are now hearing this conversation resurfacing again. The Arab League has called for naming them in the terrorist list. This is going to have huge consequences on civil society work in general in Yemen, and it will isolate the country even more. And it needs to be really studied, and it needs to be selective, not collective designation. If they are going through that process. So what we are seeing is an escalation of violence, and I'm hoping that it is a scenario towards pushing all the parties to go for peace, pressuring them to go for peace. We saw these kinds of escalations before Kuwait. So I'm hoping that we are seeing the same signs. If not, I'm afraid that we might face a scenario that is more devastating. Unfortunately, with all the suffering that we saw in Yemen, we still haven't seen the worst. If we look at Mosul and what happened in Mosul and the old city, that was devastating. Until today, they are still trying to bring that city to life. So we need the international community to work harder to bring all the parties to a political process as soon as possible. I've seen the signs again when the Quint yesterday issued a statement. This shows that the international community is somehow now more united towards pushing for a peace process. This for me also is a positive sign that there would be hopefully a political process. We need to push for more a political solution rather than a military solution. And I hope this, frankly, is for me, what I see is the last chance for Houthis to go for a peace process. Otherwise, what is going to come is going to be really harsh, and it's really going to exacerbate the humanitarian suffering more than what it is right now. Let me stop here, and I'm happy to address more in the questions. Thank you, Hadith.
Thank you, Rasha. Dr. Anel?
Thanks so much, and really appreciate getting to be here to speak with you all. I hope I'm not too much of a disappointment. Bruce Rydell of Brookings was originally going to have this slot, but apparently had a conflict, so I came in at the last minute. So apologies that I'm not Bruce. Bruce and I did co-author a piece for Brookings that came out, let me see, I believe in September, where we talked about, the title of the piece is Biden's Broken Promise on Yemen. So Hadil, to get to your question of sort of assessing where the Biden administration is, we were saying essentially, you know, initially when Biden came out in February and prioritized Yemen, there was a lot of excitement among those of us focused on Yemen, hoping that perhaps this new diplomatic push really could help achieve a ceasefire, that the emphasis on diplomacy would get somewhere, that the Trump administration's policies, which had reflected really just a preference for Saudi Arabia, that had not achieved. So there was a lot of excitement almost exactly a year ago on February 4th. But as we talked about in the piece, unfortunately, we haven't actually seen a lot of changes. And I think the fact that at the moment the Biden administration says they are reconsidering a redesignation of the Houthis as a terrorist organization just reflects the fact that there's not actually that much difference between the Trump administration's approach to the conflict and now what we're seeing from Biden, unfortunately. I just want to be clear, I do very much think that a redesignation of the Houthis would be a bad idea. I agree with Rasha that collective punishment is not the answer. But I understand things look different now to the administration, given that the Houthis have now shown the capacity to potentially kill or cause casualties among American service members in places like the UAE, as well as Saudi Arabia. So I do think things are different, but the same considerations that caused many humanitarian organizations and many Yemenis and just many people last year to say, look, the FTO designation of the Houthis is not actually going to hurt the Houthis all that much. It's just going to further devastate the people of Yemen. That an FTO is just the wrong decision here. None of those considerations have changed. And in fact, I think things are much worse. So I do hope that we won't be seeing that decision coming out of the administration today or yesterday. I did, Ned Price, the State Department spokesman, was asked about it, and he essentially said it's under review. We're taking a close look. And then he ended by saying, we are using every appropriate tool and will continue to use every appropriate tool to hold the Houthis to account. So I was trying to suss out, did that mean they won't introduce this new tool, or hard to know. We'll just have to wait and see. But I do worry about what that would mean for Yemen. One point I do think that is important to make. I've heard from administration officials this point that the Houthis are unwilling to come to the negotiating table. And on the one hand, I think this reflects the fact that they felt for the past several years they were winning. So what incentives did they have to come to the negotiating table? But I also think there's a lot of culpability of the international community here, that the terms set out by the UN Security Council back in 2015 of Resolution 2216 remain the framework that the international community officially adopts towards the Yemen conflict. And this was put in place very much according to Saudi preferences, that essentially the Houthis would have to give up all territory and give up all of their weapons. And this just doesn't seem to be something that they would ever accept. I mean, I think it would be great if that happened, but I just don't see them coming to the negotiating table even if they're losing, I think this would just be a non-starter for them. And so I think in many ways, this was something that the former special envoy for Yemen at the UN, Jamal Ben Omar, I believe, was saying that the permanent members of the UN Security Council have not been cooperating to try to bring peace to Yemen. Instead, they've been competing with each other for these lucrative military contracts with Saudi Arabia and with the UAE. And we have not seen this coordinated effort to really perhaps advance a new UN Security Council resolution that would provide a more realistic set of terms to not only get the Houthis to the table, but also to have much better representation for women's groups, for civil society groups, for other groups that are not represented at negotiations when they had happened previously. So personally, I think that there's been a lot of blame aimed at groups on the ground, when we need to be aiming a lot more blame at actors like the United States and like the UK, who could be doing a lot more here. And I think to say that the Biden administration has been pushing hard for diplomacy, I would say no. They've very roundly condemned the Houthis, and they continue to voice their support for the Saudis, which I just don't really, I see that as a very biased perspective. If the US wants to be taken seriously as a negotiator, they need to adopt a stance that would encourage other actors to come to the table as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anel. Mr. Farstein?
Thank you, Hadil, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Let me just respond to your opening questions and make a few points. A year ago, almost exactly a year ago, the Biden administration announced that they were going to prioritize finding a resolution to the Yemen conflict, and appointed Tim Lenderking and said that we would emphasize diplomacy as our preferred resolution, supporting the UN Special Envoy and the UN-led negotiations, and that we would also encourage the Saudis to step back from their offensive operations inside of Yemen in order to help promote a return to negotiations. The expectation on the part of the administration at that point was that the parties would welcome it and agree to follow through on the declaration that Martin Griffiths had been trying to negotiate for over a year at that point. The government announced that they would support it. The Saudis announced that they were supportive and were ready for a ceasefire. Unfortunately, the party that refused the initiative and refused to agree to return to negotiations was the Houthis. And in fact, not only did the Houthis decline to return to negotiations, they very clearly misunderstood or misinterpreted President Biden's intent, and determined that this was a position of weakness on the part of the United States, and that if we were to succeed in forcing the Saudis and their coalition to back off of operations inside of Yemen, that in fact it would open the door for Houthi military victory. And what we've seen over the past year is precisely that the Houthis have tried their best to achieve a victory on the battlefield that they hadn't been able to achieve earlier on. So at this point, a year later, I think that the important thing is for the international community to go back to first principles in resolving the Yemen conflict. And that is to establish very clearly that there is no military path to victory in Yemen on either side. The fact of the matter is that the coalition and the government cannot and will not achieve a military outcome, but it's very important to demonstrate to the Houthis as well, that they do not have a military option, and that their only hope of resolving this conflict and of getting any advantage out of this is through a negotiated process. There has been a mistaken impression in Washington and perhaps elsewhere that a number of people have expressed from time to time that we should acknowledge that the Houthis have quote unquote won the conflict in Yemen. This is not correct. And in fact, the evidence over the past few weeks, not only the ability of the militias supported by the coalition, the Giants Brigade and others to push the Houthis out of Shabwa, and what we're seeing right now are continued successes by the anti-Houthi coalition in Marib, is a demonstration that, in fact, the Houthis do not have the capacity to win. And I should also make the point that from a US perspective, we should not want to see Houthi victory in Yemen. I think that that would be a disaster for the Yemeni people, for the region, and I think for the entire international community. And so we need to change the dynamics of the conflict. I think that those dynamics are beginning to change, but we need to continue to press for those changes. One is to make clear that we support the efforts of the government and the coalition to prevent Houthi victory in Marib and Al Jalf and elsewhere in the country. Again, not to change the sense that we're leading to a negotiation, but to make clear to the Houthis and to reinforce with the Houthi leadership that their only option is negotiation. It's not military. And I would make the observation, and I think that many people on the screen may have their own views on this, but I think one of the issues that we need to keep in mind is that the Houthi movement is not a monolithic movement. There are factions within the Houthi movement. There are some who would be supportive of a negotiation, who would like to participate in an effort to find a peaceful way out of this conflict. But there are others who still believe wrongly that they can succeed on the battlefield, and that what we need to do is to strengthen the hand of those who are arguing in favor of negotiation and against those who still want to pursue battlefield victories. I think it's extremely important, and of course we've seen in recent days Jake Sullivan meeting with the Saudi and Emirati ambassadors, I think to certainly make clear that the US will continue to support the efforts of Saudi Arabia and the UAE to defend themselves from these drone and ballistic missile attacks that they've been encountering. But I think, and we have lost a little bit of perspective on one aspect of Houthi recent behavior, and that is their piracy in the Red Sea. And the fact of the matter is that this is a challenge not only in the context of the Yemen conflict, but it is a challenge to the global economy, to international maritime trade, to actually the global economic interests of the entire community, China, Japan, as well as Western Europe and the United States, and that there needs to be a very clear response to that to demonstrate that there will not be any tolerance to these attacks of the Red Sea or the Bab el-Mandeb. And then finally, to carry on the comments about the FTO designation, and just to say that I, along with some of my colleagues, former ambassadors to Yemen, Barbara Bodine, Steve Sesh, actually authored a letter at the end of the Trump administration to Secretary Pompeo, arguing that FTO designation for the Houthis would be a big mistake. I think the rationale at that time. Why we wrote the letter were exactly the reasons that were mentioned. The view that it would not harm the Houthis terribly much, but that it posed threats to millions of innocent Yemeni civilians who were dependent not only on humanitarian relief operations, but also on legitimate private sector food and other kinds of imports into Yemen that would be threatened if banks were unwilling to issue letters of credit and to do other things that allowed normal commerce to continue. So we wrote that letter. Obviously, the Trump administration took a different tack. The Biden administration reversed that. I thought at the time that the Biden administration was correct in doing that. I do believe that the time has come to revisit that. I think that the issues are still there in terms of humanitarian relief and the operations to protect civilians. I would hope that if there is a reconsideration of the FTO designation, that it would be done in the context of a negotiation, a dialogue with relief organizations to ensure that we could insulate their operations from the effects of a designation. But I do think that to the extent that a designation would get the attention of the Houthi leadership and hopefully would become more broadly applicable. A US only designation would not succeed, but a broader designation that would include other partners, other countries might have more of an effect on the Houthis. And that's something to be explored. But again, only in the context of, can you do it in a way that we don't end up damaging the broader Yemeni population. The last point that I'll make is, again, I think that we're all agreed that the ultimate objective here is to get back to the negotiating table, to support the efforts of Hans Grunberg and the UN-led negotiations to convince all the parties that they have to sit down at the table, work this out. Anna now mentioned this issue of UNSCR 2216. This has been an issue that's been raised repeatedly. Let me just say that in my own view, 2216 stopped having any application to the conflict in Yemen years ago. I don't think that anybody who's sitting at the negotiating table today would consider themselves to be bound by the terms of 2216. It is a dead letter. I think that there's no reason to spend any time worrying about whether people think that 2216 is still applicable or not. So let me stop there. And again, as my colleagues have said, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you all for answering that question. Back to you, Rasha. So, with the Houthis threat being more, on the region, not just Yemen, being more apparent, especially now that they're attacking the UAE, to what extent do you think that, decision make, like Yemenis still have a say over the trajectory of the war or the future of Yemen?
Thank you, Hadil. And I am relating to the points delivered by Anil and His Excellency the Ambassador. So for Abu Dhabi attack, I think it's a way that will involve UAE more in the war after the setback or the withdrawal that we witnessed before. It's going to now involve the UAE more. And this not only means that UAE will be involved militarily more massively, but also diplomatically, because now they are sitting on the UN Security Council chair. So they will be able also to influence diplomatically at the UN Security Council level. The targeting of the US will make the US back the UAE in both levels, whether militarily or diplomatically. And so what I'm seeing basically is more escalation of the war. And coming back to the ship that was and the piracy that happened by the Houthis, this is also another dangerous step or a big, huge mistake that they have done, because there is a resolution for Somalia, for the coast of Somalia, that prevents piracy. It's under Chapter 7, which means the UN Security Council can interfere militarily in the Somali coast. And that UN Security Council resolution can also expand to Yemen very, very easily now. And this means that Hodeidah, because that's where the piracy happened, or near Hodeidah, this means that Stockholm resolution will collapse, and the immunity of Hodeidah, that's what I'm considering that peace agreement was, will be broken, and it will escalate again the military situation. Now, the tendency to designate the Houthis as terrorism internationally, there is a push by the regional actors and by the government actors and the Arab League now, because this will also give some leeway to have vicious attack on the Houthis, and is used also to justify any international humanitarian law and international human rights law violations. So it's very dangerous. I think a lot of Yemenis are supporting the notion of designating the Houthis as terrorists because they are suffering from the Houthis, but they don't know what that means. That means it's going to affect us all as Yemenis, whether we are inside or outside Yemen. It will affect our movement, travel, our business. If any company wants to interact with the international community, buy anything, it's going to close. It will have a big impact on this kind of transactions. The same thing for civil society. For example, us as Peace Track Initiative, we do track 2 diplomacy. We need to engage with all armed groups in Yemen. We need to engage with the Houthis. We will not be able to do any kind of mitigation efforts because it's going to put us at risk. Now, let me stop here, and if there is any anything that I need to add, I will add later. Thank you so much, Hadi.
Absolutely, thank you, Rasha. Anil, you know, we've been discussing this a lot for the past year, and so, you know, it's very difficult to, you know, to pressure Houthis, for the international community to pressure Houthis because they don't have the leverage on them. Do you think, you know, the concept of international pressure on Houthis is worth pursuing? Is it possible given the group's isolation? And also, you know, Yemen is also entangled in this, you know, regional geopolitics. So when it comes to Iran, what do you think would be the impact of a, you know, more U.S.-Iran cooperation under JCPOA on the, you know, on the war in Yemen and on the U.S. involvement in it?
Thanks, Hadiel. I'll try to get those questions and a few of the others that have come up in the chat. No, I certainly agree that it's proved very difficult to pressure the Houthis to the negotiating table. There was a question from Al-Khadr Suleiman about, well, maybe an FTO designation would in fact be the pressure that is needed. Again, I just worry that the same reasons that so many groups came out a year ago against the designation was just that it is much more likely to negatively impact Yemenis, and that we wouldn't necessarily expect the Houthis to be impacted, that they are not necessarily all that plugged in internationally. Obviously, Iran would ignore, it would not affect Iran's behavior. I also fear that it would allow the Houthis to shift the blame, that at the moment when it's clear that the Houthis are responsible for blocking aid or for seizing aid and just generally interfering with the process of allowing aid distribution, that it's clear they're the actors responsible. But if it were the US who had designated them as terrorists and that was the reason the aid couldn't get through, the Houthis could then further abrogate any responsibility. It would also sort of enhance the image they've cultivated as defending against the foreign invaders in many ways that are similar to the Taliban in Afghanistan, where even though you had many Afghans who didn't want the Taliban to be in charge because they knew what that felt like, they'd experienced it and the abuses that they'd suffered, But by the end of that war, you really had so many rural Afghans specifically who were just exhausted by war, and they just wanted it to end. And so they supported the Taliban takeover rather than to continue the violence, because they lost so many family members. I think I think the average was an individual family probably lost 10 to 12 individuals, and they just needed the violence to stop. So again, I do feel that the approach the US is taking, which is very pro-Saudi, doesn't actually put the US in a good position to try to negotiate here. Very good question, Hadil, about would a deal with Iran over Iran's nuclear program, would that perhaps enhance US leverage over Iran? I think the tricky thing there is the JCPOA has always been very specifically, and the terms of those negotiations have always been very specifically about the nuclear question, which is part of why other regional actors were frustrated, and they wanted the negotiations to include questions about Iran's missile program and support for groups around the region. And so I think even if the US were to successfully rejoin the JCPOA alongside Iran, I don't know that necessarily that would then lead to implications for these broader regional questions. I do think that the regional questions need to be worked out between Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the other members of the GCC with Iran, because these are matters that are of very high relevance for them, whereas the US has always been quite, in some ways, has had somewhat tunnel vision around the nuclear issue, understandably, just given the impact of what nuclear weapons could do to the region more broadly. Although again, Israel has had nuclear weapons for decades, and it's the US certainly is fine with that. Not to say that I think Iran should get a nuclear weapon, but again, there are already nuclear weapons in the region. I think is just important to remember, because a lot of Americans seem to forget that. There had been a question as well. Oh, I just wanted to respond to Jerry's point that he considers the UN Security Council Resolution 2216 to be a dead letter. But in that case, and this came up in the chat as well, it seems like it's high time, therefore, for the UNSC to introduce a new resolution on Yemen. If no one's paying attention to 2216, clearly the UN needs to return to this issue, therefore. Another question that had come up, sorry, I know there are a lot of questions in the chat, and I don't know if we can get to everyone. In general, I think that the United States just needs to be very aware of the fact that the role that we're playing at the moment seems to be contributing to this escalation. We had seen Biden saying he was going to end all US support for offensive military operations, but then we did see 2 new weapon sales go through last year, and there's a question, are these offensive or defensive? But I think the overall point is it was a clear signal of support for the Saudis. And that, again, this is, if the US is trying to say that they're coming in as sort of a neutral arbiter here, this is not the behavior of an actor that is trying to be neutral. I think if the US just wants to say, yeah, we're not neutral, and we have a very clear preference here, which I think Jerry's comments, illustrated that clearly, that the US wants the Saudi-led coalition to win, then the Biden administration should just be more upfront about that. But then that brings up the question of, well, how is this central to US interests? And I think, Hadil, one last point, your question about have these recent attacks and the escalation taken the conflict out of Yemeni's hands? Unfortunately, I think the conflict has been out of Yemeni's hands almost since the beginning, since the invasion or the beginning of the Saudi coalition's intervention back in 2015. Yemenis have been subject to all of this foreign involvement, and so, arguably Saudi Arabia has been intervening in Yemen since long before then. But I do think that we know from the scholarly literature that civil wars where you have foreign resources pouring in tend to last a lot longer than civil wars where the domestic actors on the ground have to deal with their own resource limitations of money and personnel and willingness to keep fighting. And so I do think this is why it's unlikely that we're going to see these actors being willing to come to the negotiating table on either side until they know that it's really just, it's back to Yemenis now, and Yemenis are going to have to work it out between them. But as long as there's money coming in from Iran and the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Americans are involved, the war is likely to continue, and as we've seen, likely to escalate.
Thank you, Anel. Gerald, just one final question before we go to audience questions. So, we know that the US has been embroiled in what is called the war in terror in the Middle East for many years now. So how does America's goal to fight Al-Qaeda in Yemen, is shaping their involvement in Yemen's war?
It's a very good question, Hadil, and I think that fundamentally the U.S. has tried its best to distinguish between these two issues, and the U.S. position has been that we'll continue to prosecute the war against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula where we have those opportunities. We've done that, but to distinguish very clearly between that and the broader conflict that's going on in the country between the Houthis and the government, and now, of course, with many complications in that. And so it's been difficult. I think that the concern is certainly there that not only Al-Qaeda but also the Islamic State has been able to use this period of conflict and governmental collapse in Yemen as opportunities to strengthen their position. They have, in some instances, been able to basically associate themselves with some of the operations and to try to embed themselves with the broader Yemeni community in a way that's going to be unhelpful down the road. So I'm afraid that once the conflict ends, we're going to be back in a situation where there's going to have to be a lot of attention paid to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, it also reflects broader issues in the region, whether or not Al-Qaeda senior leadership is able to find a new safe haven in Afghanistan and increase their operations, what is going to happen more broadly in terms of these threats of violent extremism, both internally in Yemen, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the number one victims of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula were in fact Yemenis. They weren't Americans or Europeans or anybody else. But also the threat to the broader regional community, and so I would say that if I can go back, to Anel's last comment, or on the FTO designation, and please, I take Russia and Anel's concerns very seriously. Again, I wrote a letter that was signed by over 100 former U.S. diplomats and senior government officials in December of 2020, making some of the same points that Russia and now made. I would consider, still, I would be concerned if that was the way the U.S. pursued that. If there is a reconsideration, I think that we should only do it if we can do it in a way that narrows the scope of the designation and does not harm the critical work that Russia and many of the other members of civil society in Yemen are doing, or impede humanitarian relief operations or do any of these other things. All of the concerns that have been raised are serious. I think that if the administration is thinking about it, they need to address it, and we should only move forward if there's satisfaction that it can be done in a way that doesn't harm those vital interests. And on the issue of Security Council resolution, look, the reality is that there's not consensus within the P5 at the moment. And to try to introduce a new resolution right now would probably not be, it probably would not prosper. What I would suggest is that we negotiate, find a solution, and at the end of the negotiation, introduce that as a UN Security Council resolution to get the international community's approval for what was decided at the negotiating table, which I'm confident would not be a problem. You know, rather than get hung up in something that is not likely to be successful or helpful at this moment, I think that the focus should be on getting the parties to negotiation. Again, I'm quite confident that when Hans Grunberg sits down at the table with the parties, he's not going to be checking in on what, you know, subpara 3, section 4 says in UNSCR 2216. That's not the way it's going to work.
Thank you. So there is a question in the chat from Huria Mashhour, and she's asking if the Biden administration is going to take account of the economic crisis like the AU. And also, you know, we've seen researchers, specifically Peter Salisbury of Crisis in Action, who is the crisis group, sorry, who is advocating for, you know, this concept of an economic ceasefire in Yemen. So if any of the speakers and perhaps Rasha could, you know, what are your thoughts on this issue?
Thank you, Hadil. But let me just go back a little bit about the UN Security Council Resolution 2216. I think it has become, in Arabic, mismarguha. It has become an excuse. Why not to implement the peace? Why? It's not about the UN Security Council resolution. And if there is gaps in that resolution, it can be easily addressed in a new resolution, but building on it, not completely revoking it, basically. But the notion that this resolution is the reason why we're not going towards a peace process, or the peace process is not advancing because of the resolution, I think we need to, there is many ways to interpret that resolution. The resolution actually says all parties. It talks about Houthis, it talks about the legitimate government and Hadi specifically, but in its language, it says all parties, which means that the peace process needs to be inclusive. And this is something that we keep advocating for, that we need an inclusive peace that includes women and all the factions and groups that are not included. The other thing that I wanted to raise before I go into the economic question was, for us, with the escalation of human rights violations and the termination of the mandate of the group of eminent experts last October, this has become very challenging, and we need the US support as well to advocate or to push for an accountability mechanism, alternative one, that will continue to document the human rights violations in Yemen. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, there was a question also about the South issue. I think the international community is increasingly now thinking about any solution in Yemen in a way that it's not going to be less than a federal governance system. In the Feminist Peace Roadmap, we also pushed for the discussion of the South issue in the political process. So once they go into the peace process, it needs to be discussed. And then during any transitional period that comes after, it needs to be discussed. So the South issue needs to be a priority again and be discussed and not pushed on the side, because that's also creating more and more conflict. Now coming back to your question about the economic track, what I'm seeing is that the UN envoy is, I think, creating a track that is focusing on the economic recovery. And this is very important. What I'm worried about is, I think the UN and the US need to allocate resources to create a mechanism for the economic track that is also like working together with the UN envoy and the US envoy and other mechanisms that exist. But it cannot be the only focus of the mediation process or part of the mediation process. I feel like it's going to become too much to handle for the UN envoy alone. So he needs more support and more, I would say, resources. And in my head, I feel like a specific mechanism for economic recovery that is competent and that is not political. So it's not affected by the political scene, and they take the decision. And this is something we proposed as well in the Feminist Peace Roadmap, that we need to create a joint mechanism of international community, of the national parties to be part of this and to prioritize the economic situation, no matter what the outcome of the political stream is. So, and I will stop here. Thank you, Hadi.
Thank you, Rasha. There's a question to Mr. Jerry. So in Yemen, the decision of the war, this is from Khaled Al-Usaimi. The decision of the war has been made outside of Yemen. Similarly, the decision of peace needs to be made outside of Yemen. Does Iran wish to end the war in Yemen?
It's a very good question, and for a lot of people, it's kind of the central question. Let me just go back very quickly to Russia's last point about the role of the international community on the economy. To say that I've been participating for the last year or so in a small group, RAND Corporation and several other groups that have developed what we call the Yemen Support Initiative, that is precisely aimed at doing the kind of thing that Russia is talking about, of trying to structure an international effort to help build the institutional capacity in Yemen to rebuild the economy, to do the other things that are going to be necessary to rebuild the country in a post-conflict scenario. And the real challenge is, is there an economic track that is viable and sustainable in a period when the conflict is still going on? And that's a harder question. But we're very much seized with this idea that once the war ends, the number one requirement for the Yemeni people is going to have to be getting the economy working again, getting people working again, getting families able to sustain and support themselves again. So, that understand completely. In terms of the role of Iran, it's a very good question, and I think that there was hope, rather, that the Iranians, when the Biden administration made the announcement and also said very clearly that they were going to look for a way of re-engaging with Iran on the nuclear file and then maybe other issues, I think that there was some hope that the Iranians would become more supportive of trying to find a solution in Yemen, and that in some sense, and one of the reasons that the Biden administration made the decision to prioritize Yemen last year was this idea that if the parties all agreed, that in fact the mechanisms for finding the end of the conflict would be available and would be achievable. It hasn't worked out that way, and the Iranians, neither in Vienna nor, as we understand it, in their contacts with Saudi Arabia or with the UAE, have offered to be helpful in finding a resolution. In fact, what we understand is whenever the question has been put to them, they've kind of brushed it off and changed the subject. And there is certainly concern and some speculation that, in fact, the Iranians are trying to use the Yemen conflict as leverage to improve their negotiating position in Vienna, which of course would be tragic for the Yemeni people and not terribly likely to succeed for the Iranians. So, this has been a disappointment, frankly, and I think that we need to continue to pressure Iran, and certainly, Russia and China have the capability to engage Iran on this issue and to press the Iranians to be more forthcoming on helping to find a way out of this conflict in Yemen.
Thank you, Jerry. And perhaps last questions, Nabi and El can answer that. So there's a question that is asking whether the Houthi missile attack on the UAE is an attempt to force the US into taking a more direct role in the conflict. And there's also another question about, why both the US admins, past and present, gave Saudi Arabia full authority to be in charge of the Yemen war without having a say on their part. There's a comment that the US administration doesn't have any plan to end the war or listen to different parties like the STC. Your thoughts?
Thanks. Yeah, I don't, I mean, it would seem fairly foolish of the Houthis to try to get the US to be more involved, given the effects we are likely to see, such as an FTO or perhaps increased military involvement by the US. But again, I do think that in general, the Houthis are a militant group, and the language they seem to understand is violence. And so I suppose it's not all that surprising that they're merely trying to escalate to perhaps try to enhance their position. I don't think that is likely to work out for them. I think one issue we haven't talked about, and I know has come up in the comments, and I think may be important for a lot of folks on the call, does have to do with the question of the future of the South. And I know Rasha mentioned sort of at the minimum a federal system, but at the maximum perhaps an independent South. And I don't know what that is going to end up looking like, but I do think it is interesting, given that we had seen previously the UAE and the Saudis to a certain extent working at cross purposes to each other. Obviously the Saudis very strenuously supporting the Hadi government, and the UAE up until relatively recently constraining more of their involvement to the territories of the former South Yemen. And that we saw a shift, obviously now with the Al-Amalika brigades as a UAE-sponsored group and the territory they have retaken. And my understanding of the UAE's interests in Yemen are very much centered on the notion of perhaps a future independent or perhaps just autonomous South Yemen, and that the UAE would perhaps see that as a strategically important perhaps client state, or just a state that they would have very close relations with. And this is part of why we've seen their involvement. And so I do wonder about the meetings that happened at the end of last year, where the US may have said, look, UAE, we need you to stop operating in a way that isn't actually helping the Saudis here. We need to see more cooperation on your part. And then perhaps the US, and again, I'm just speculating here, but this notion that perhaps the level of cooperation we're seeing now may have had to do with something pertaining to the future of South Yemen. Again, the US being very concerned about the future of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, as are all regional actors involved. So I wonder there about the shift that we had seen and the level of cooperation. Hadil, you had another question that I didn't answer. Could you remind me what it was?
Yeah, I think it was about the U.S. administration not having a plan to to end the war in Yemen.
I mean, unfortunately, I think that what has been clear throughout is that the United States very much has a preference for the way the war ends. I think if the real purpose here was to just get to a ceasefire and just end it, we wouldn't see the sort of activities that we've seen from the US. I mean, I think there is a question then of what would be the cost of that if there were just impose a ceasefire and end all support. I think there are many inside Yemen who would say, well, that's just going to contribute to further conflict, because there are many who would be unsatisfied with that. For example, of ongoing Houthi control over a lot of territory would be intolerable for many people under their control. And so we continue to see the fighting persist. However, again, I do just want to reiterate the point that civil wars with a lot of foreign resources tend to drag on a lot longer. And so I do think that returning control of the Yemen conflict to Yemenis, we are likely to then see a lot of processes that the people of Yemen have long used to work out, to manage conflicts internally. Those processes could still come back into action, but they haven't been given a chance to do so because we have such an extreme level of foreign involvement. So again, I think the most important point here is to try to get the Yemen conflict back into the hands of Yemenis and not have it dictated by these geopolitical outsider concerns.
Thank you, Anil. If we still have like time for one or two more questions, because we're getting really good questions in the chat. There is one for Mr. Jerry from Ibrahim Khattabi. He's saying, given that Yemeni islands like Socotra and others are taken by the Saudi UAE military, what is the likelihood of Yemenis regaining that? Would that be a problem getting both countries out of the Yemeni islands?
Yeah, I think that it's absolutely essential for Yemen to assert sovereignty over all of its territory, including Socotra. You know, I mean, we talked about perhaps, you know, whether there are negative aspects of 2216 that need to be addressed. But here's a positive aspect of 2216 that I think that everybody should rely on. And that is that 2216 says very clearly that the international community supports the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and unity of Yemen. And that should be broadly applicable to all parts of the country. So I do think that, you know, it's been very unclear exactly what's been happening on Socotra for quite some time now, and unclear about what exactly the intent is of the various actors that have been engaged in Socotra. But I do think that from a U.S. perspective and from an international perspective, the intent is very clear, and that is that Yemen belongs to Yemenis and not to anybody else.
All right, I think this is a good point to end our discussion for today. Thank you so much for our distinguished speakers, and thank you for the audience for your thoughtful questions. I wish all of you a wonderful day. Thank you.